A man walks into a gym in 1947, his shoulders so wide they barely fit through the doorframe, his waist so narrow it looks like it was carved by a sculptor's chisel, and arms that ripple with power even when he's standing completely still. People stop mid-rep to stare. Some whisper that he can't be real. Others swear he must have some secret formula, some genetic advantage that nobody else possesses. But here's the thing that nobody believed until they saw it with their own eyes. Steve Reeves built his legendary physique training just 3 days a week, eating 3 simple meals a day, and never touching a single performance-enhancing drug in his entire life. Yeah, you heard that right. While modern bodybuilders are injecting, swallowing, and slathering on every chemical compound known to science, this man became the most famous bodybuilder on planet Earth completely naturally. And that's just the beginning of the stories that sound too incredible to be true. Steve Reeves didn't just redefine what the human body could look like. He shattered every preconceived notion about strength, aesthetics, and what was possible without pharmaceutical assistance. When Arnold Schwarzenegger was still a kid in Austria, dreaming of becoming somebody, he had one poster on his wall. Not of a superhero, not of a movie star, but of Steve Reeves as Hercules. Arnold would later say that Steve Reeves was the greatest bodybuilder of all time. And this wasn't just respect, it was reverence. But the stories about Steve that spread through bodybuilding gyms, Hollywood studios, and eventually around the world seemed so fantastical that people dismissed them as exaggerations, myths, tall tales blown out of proportion by time and repetition. Until photographs emerged. Until film footage surfaced. Until people who knew him personally came forward and confirmed every single unbelievable detail. Let's start with the origin story, because even that sounds like fiction. Steve Reeves was born on January 21, 1926, in a tiny town called Glasgow, Montana. We're talking about a place so small that if you blinked while driving through it, you'd miss it entirely. His father died in a farming accident when Steve was just an infant, and his mother, struggling to survive during the Great Depression, moved the family to Oakland, California. Young Steve grew up skinny, awkward, and painfully shy. He wasn't the athletic kid, wasn't the popular kid, wasn't anything special to look at. In fact, if you'd seen teenage Steve Reeves, you would never in a million years predict what he would become. But something happened when he was around 15 years old. He saw a magazine featuring John Grimek, a champion bodybuilder with a physique that looked like it belonged to a Greek god. Something clicked in Steve's mind. He didn't just want to look like that. He became absolutely obsessed with the idea of transforming his body. With whatever money he could scrape together, Steve bought himself a basic weight set. Not the fancy equipment we have today, but crude iron plates and a simple barbell. He set up in his family's basement and started training with an intensity that bordered on fanatical. But here's where the story gets interesting. Steve didn't follow any traditional program. He didn't have a coach, didn't have a mentor, didn't have the internet to look up routines. He experimented on his own body, trying different exercises, different rep ranges, different frequencies, observing how his muscles responded and adjusting accordingly. He was essentially conducting a one-man scientific experiment, and his body was the laboratory. Within a year, people who knew him couldn't believe the transformation. Within 2 years, he'd gained over 30 pounds of solid muscle and looked like a completely different human being. But Steve wasn't satisfied. He kept pushing, kept experimenting, kept refining his physique with the precision of a master sculptor working on his greatest creation. Then came World War II. Steve enlisted in the army, and this is where one of the most unbelievable stories about him originates. During basic training, the drill sergeant, trying to assert dominance over the new recruits, sparked out the command, "Everyone get down and give me 20 push-ups." All the recruits dropped to the ground and started cranking out push-ups, their arms shaking, faces turning red from effort. All except Steve. He just laid down on the ground, completely still, like he was taking a nap. The drill sergeant went ballistic. He stormed over, screaming in Steve's face, threatening him with every punishment imaginable. Steve calmly looked up at him and said, "Sergeant, I can do 20 push-ups in my sleep. I'm not going to waste my energy on something so easy. If you want to see what I can really do, let's make this interesting." The sergeant, furious but intrigued, told Steve to show him what he had. Steve proceeded to bang out 100 push-ups, barely breaking a sweat, while the rest of the platoon could only stare in disbelief. The drill sergeant, humbled and impressed, never gave Steve a hard time again. But more importantly, Word spread through the military base about this kid with superhuman strength, and that reputation would follow him for the rest of his life. After his military service ended, Steve returned to California with one goal: to become a champion bodybuilder. In 1947, he entered his first major competition, Mr. Pacific Coast, and won. Then he kept winning. Mr. Western America, Mr. America, Mr. World. And finally, in 1950, at just 23 years old, Steve Reeves won the Mr. Universe title, the most prestigious honor in bodybuilding. But what made Steve different from every other champion wasn't just that he won. It was how he looked when he won. His physique was so perfectly proportioned, so aesthetically pleasing, that it didn't even look human. His measurements were legendary: 6'1", 215 pounds, 18-inch biceps, 51-inch chest, and here's the kicker: a 29-inch waist. That waist-to-chest ratio was so extreme that it looked photoshopped, except Photoshop wouldn't exist for another 40 years. Scientists and mathematicians actually analyzed his proportions and found that his physique came closer to the golden ratio, the mathematical formula for perfect beauty, than any other human being ever documented. But winning Mr. Universe wasn't enough for Steve. He had bigger ambitions. He wanted to be a movie star, which in the 1950s seemed absolutely impossible for a bodybuilder. Hollywood executives looked at muscular physiques as freakish, unmarketable, something that would scare audiences rather than attract them. Steve faced rejection after rejection. Casting directors told him he was too big, too muscular, that he'd never work in films. One particularly memorable rejection came from a major studio head who told Steve, "You look like a circus act. Nobody wants to see a man who looks like you on the big screen." But Steve didn't give up. He kept training, kept going to auditions, kept believing that eventually someone would see his potential. That someone turned out to be an Italian producer named Pietro Francisci, who was developing a low-budget film about the mythological hero Hercules. Francisci had been searching for years for someone who could embody the legendary strongman, someone who actually looked like they could perform the incredible feats attributed to the character. When he saw Steve Reeves, he knew his search was over. The 1958 film, Hercules, changed everything. Not just for Steve Reeves, not just for bodybuilding, but for action cinema itself. The movie was shot in Italy on a shoestring budget, with special effects that were primitive even by 1950s standards. But none of that mattered because Steve Reeves was Hercules. Every scene where he was on screen, audiences couldn't take their eyes off him. There's this famous sequence in the movie where Hercules has to hold back two horses pulling in opposite directions. The producers initially planned to use trick photography and wires to make it look impressive. But Steve told them, "Just get the horses. I'll actually do it." They thought he was insane. Two full-grown horses, each weighing over 1,000 pounds, pulling with all their strength in opposite directions, and Steve believed he could actually hold them? But they set up the shot just to humor him. The horses started pulling. Steve's muscles exploded, every fiber visible under his skin, veins bulging, face contorted with effort. And he held them. He actually held two horses apart through sheer strength. The film crew stood there with their mouths open. They used that take in the movie because they realized no special effect could ever look as authentic as what Steve just did for real. Hercules became a phenomenon. In Italy, it broke every box office record. When it was released in America by distributor Joseph E. Levine, it made over $20 million, which in 1950s money was an absolutely astronomical sum. Overnight, Steve Reeves became one of the most recognized faces on Earth. He went from being a bodybuilder that most people had never heard of to being an international movie star commanding the highest salary of any actor in Europe. Think about that for a second. This was the same guy who just a few years earlier couldn't get a single Hollywood studio to give him a chance, and now he was out earning established movie stars. The success of Hercules spawned an entire genre of sword and sandal epics, sometimes called peplum films, and Steve starred in a whole series of them. Hercules Unchained, Goliath and the Barbarians, The Giant of Marathon, The Trojan Horse, Duel of the Titans. Each one made millions. Each one showcased Steve's incredible physique. And each one convinced more people around the world that bodybuilding wasn't freakish. It was heroic. But here's where the stories about Steve Reeves take a darker turn, revealing the price he paid for his success. During the filming of The Last Days of Pompeii in 1959, there was a chariot racing scene that required intense physical stunts. Steve, always insisting on doing his own stunts because he felt it made the scenes more authentic, climbed into the chariot and took control of the horses. The scene required him to drive at high speed through a narrow path between trees. Something went wrong. The horses spooked. The chariot veered off course. Steve tried to regain control, pulling with all his legendary strength on the reins, but it was too late. The chariot slammed directly into a tree at full speed. The impact was devastating. Steve's shoulder dislocated completely, the bones separating with such force that witnesses heard the pop from 20 feet away. The pain was excruciating, the kind that would make most men pass out immediately. But Steve, showing the same toughness he'd displayed throughout his life, calmly reached across with his other hand and snapped his shoulder back into the socket himself. The film crew stared in horror and amazement. They called for medical help, assuming Steve was done filming for months. But Steve, after a brief rest, insisted on continuing to shoot that very same day. What nobody knew at the time, what Steve kept hidden from almost everyone, was that this injury would haunt him for the rest of his life. The shoulder never properly healed. In each subsequent film, every stunt he performed aggravated the injury more. He was in constant pain, but he never complained, never asked for easier roles, never stopped doing his own stunts. He'd tape up his shoulder, take some basic painkillers. Remember, Steve refused to take anything stronger because he wanted to stay natural and push through. People working with him on film sets would later recount hearing him grit his teeth during particularly demanding physical scenes, sometimes seeing tears in his eyes from the pain, but his face on camera never showed it. That level of mental toughness, that refusal to show weakness, that determination to give audiences the authentic hero they expected, it was superhuman. But it also meant Steve was destroying his body for the sake of his art and his audience. The injury wasn't just physical. It began to limit what roles Steve could take, what stunts he could perform. By the mid-1960s, the constant pain became too much. In 1969, at the peak of his fame, when he could have continued making movies and earning enormous paychecks for years, Steve Reeves retired from acting. He was only 43 years old. When reporters asked him why he was walking away from such a successful career, Steve gave a response that revealed his philosophy about life. "I've made enough money to be comfortable. I've achieved everything I wanted to achieve in films. Now I want to live, really live, on my own terms." And that's exactly what he did. Steve took his earnings and bought a 14-acre ranch in Valley Center, California. He wasn't going to be a Hollywood star anymore. He was going to be a rancher, breeding and training Morgan horses, living a quiet life away from cameras and crowds. But even in retirement, Steve Reeves couldn't escape being Steve Reeves. His ranch became a pilgrimage site for bodybuilders and fans from around the world. People would drive for hours just hoping to catch a glimpse of the legend. And Steve, despite valuing his privacy, was remarkably generous with his time. He'd invite visitors in, show them around the ranch, talk about training philosophy and life philosophy. One story that perfectly captures who Steve was involves a young bodybuilder who showed up unannounced at his ranch, nervous and starstruck. The kid stammered out that he'd driven all the way from Nevada just to meet Steve, to ask him for advice about training. Instead of turning him away, Steve invited him to stay for the weekend. He showed the young man his training methods, cooked meals for him, shared stories about the golden age of bodybuilding. When the young bodybuilder finally left, Steve refused to accept any payment or compensation. He told him, "Someday when you're successful, help someone else the same way I helped you. That's payment enough." That young bodybuilder later became a successful trainer himself. And he never forgot that weekend, never forgot Steve's generosity, and spent his career paying forward the kindness he received. During his retirement years, Steve became an outspoken advocate for natural bodybuilding. As the sport became increasingly dominated by anabolic steroids and other performance-enhancing drugs in the 1970s and 1980s, Steve watched with sadness and frustration. He gave interviews where he didn't mince words about what he saw happening to bodybuilding. "The sport has lost its way," he said in one famous interview. "Bodybuilding was supposed to be about health, about building your body to be strong and functional and aesthetically pleasing. Now it's become about who can inject the most chemicals and inflate their muscles to inhuman sizes. These guys don't look like heroes anymore. They look like cartoons." Some people criticize Steve for being old-fashioned, for not understanding that the sport had evolved. But Steve stuck to his principles. He wrote a book titled Building the Classic Physique the Natural Way, where he outlined his training methods, his dietary approach, and his philosophy about bodybuilding being a health-oriented lifestyle rather than a competitive sport requiring pharmaceutical assistance. The training methods Steve advocated sound almost too simple to be effective, which is exactly why modern bodybuilders dismiss them for years. Steve trained 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. His workouts were never longer than 90 minutes. He performed full-body routines rather than body part splits, doing exercises like upright rows, bench presses, one-arm dumbbell rows, dumbbell side laterals, military presses, triceps pushdowns, barbell curls, dumbbell incline curls, back squats, and barbell pullovers. 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps per exercise. That's it. No drop sets, no supersets, no advanced techniques. Just basic compound movements performed with perfect form and progressive overload. When asked why he didn't train more frequently or with more volume, Steve explained, "Your muscles don't grow in the gym. They grow when you're resting. Training is just the stimulus. Recovery is where the magic happens." This was revolutionary thinking in an era when most bodybuilders believed more training automatically meant more results. Steve's diet was equally simple, which also led people to doubt its effectiveness. He ate 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. No snacking, no eating every 3 hours, none of the complicated nutrient timing that modern bodybuilders obsess over. For breakfast, Steve made a power shake. Orange juice, Knox gelatin for joint health, honey for natural energy, a banana, a few whole eggs, and a couple tablespoons of protein powder. That was it. For lunch, he'd have cottage cheese mixed with nuts and raisins, along with some fresh fruit. For dinner, he ate meat or fish with vegetables and some form of complex carbohydrate like rice or potatoes. He avoided white sugar and white flour, but he didn't count calories, didn't weigh his food, didn't stress about macros. He listened to his body. When he needed to lean down for competition or filming, he didn't change what he ate. He just ate less of it. This intuitive approach to nutrition, this trust in the body's natural signals, went against everything the fitness industry was trying to sell, which is probably why it worked so well. But the most controversial aspect of Steve's approach was his position on rest and recovery. When he was seriously training for competition, Steve didn't just sleep 8 hours a night like most people. He slept 10 to 14 hours. He'd sleep 8 hours at night, then take a long nap in the afternoon. People thought he was lazy, thought he was wasting time that could be spent training. But Steve understood something that science is only now beginning to fully appreciate. Sleep is when your body produces growth hormone, when your muscles repair and rebuild, when your nervous system recovers. Without adequate sleep, all the training in the world won't produce optimal results. Steve also took long layoffs from training, sometimes months or even years at a time, especially after he retired from competition. When he felt the desire to train seriously again, he'd come back and make incredible progress in a short time because his body was completely fresh, completely recovered. This wasn't just rest. It was strategic periodization taken to an extreme that no modern athlete would ever have the patience to attempt. The results of Steve's natural approach were so impressive that they fueled decades of rumors and speculation. People simply couldn't believe that his physique was achievable without drugs. After all, he was competing in an era before anabolic steroids were widely available or even well known. But here's the thing. Steve maintained his incredible physique well into his 60s, long after he stopped competitive training, without any pharmaceutical assistance. Steroid users typically deflate dramatically when they stop taking drugs. Steve never did. His proportions, his muscle bellies, his bone structure, they all stayed remarkably consistent throughout his life, just with variations in overall size and body fat percentage depending on his training intensity. This consistency is actually one of the strongest pieces of evidence that he really was natural, because the human body can't maintain artificially enhanced musculature without continued artificial enhancement. One of the most fascinating aspects of Steve Reeves' legacy is how he influenced generations of bodybuilders who came after him, even those who took completely different approaches. Arnold Schwarzenegger openly stated that Steve was his primary inspiration for getting into bodybuilding. Lou Ferrigno, who played the Incredible Hulk on television, cited Steve as the reason he started lifting weights. Sylvester Stallone modeled his training for the Rocky films partly on Steve's methodology. Even modern natural bodybuilding champions study Steve's proportions and try to replicate his aesthetic ideal. But perhaps more importantly, Steve influenced millions of regular people who were never going to compete in bodybuilding, never going to be professional athletes, but who saw in him proof that extraordinary physical transformation was possible through natural means, dedication, and intelligent training. The story of Steve's arms is particularly legendary in bodybuilding circles. At 18 inches, they were considered massive for his era, but what made them special wasn't just the size. It was the shape. His biceps had this perfect peak, this dramatic sweep from shoulder to elbow, that made them look even larger than they measured. People constantly asked Steve what special arm exercises he did to develop such incredible guns. His answer shocked them. I don't do special arm work. I do barbell curls and dumbbell curls with perfect form, heavy weight, and full concentration. That's it. No 20-exercise arm specialization routine, no fancy techniques, just basic curls done with dedication and consistency. There's a famous story about Steve visiting a gym in Italy during his film career. A local bodybuilder, who had decent arms himself, challenged Steve to an arm wrestling match, confident that technique would overcome raw strength. Steve, never one to back down from a friendly competition, accepted. They sat down, locked hands, and the match began. The Italian bodybuilder put everything he had into trying to force Steve's arm down, his face turning red, veins popping, maximum effort. Steve's arm didn't even budge. It was like the Italian was pushing against a granite statue. After about 10 seconds of futile effort, Steve casually, almost effortlessly, pinned the man's arm to the table. The entire gym erupted in applause. Steve just smiled, shook the man's hand, and went back to his workout. That combination of aesthetic beauty and genuine functional strength. That's what set Steve apart from every other physique athlete before or since. People who trained with Steve or watched him train consistently reported that his workout intensity was like nothing they'd ever seen. He didn't scream, didn't throw weights, didn't make a dramatic show of his efforts. But the focus, the concentration, the mind-muscle connection he achieved was almost supernatural. When Steve performed a bicep curl, he wasn't just moving weight from point A to point B. He was thinking about every single muscle fiber in his bicep contracting, visualizing the muscle growing with each repetition, maintaining perfect form no matter how heavy the weight got or how fatigued he became. He moved slowly and deliberately, squeezing at the top of each rep, controlling the negative portion, never using momentum or cheating. One training partner described it as watching a master craftsman work. Every movement had purpose, intention, perfection. This level of training discipline is incredibly rare, incredibly difficult to maintain, and probably contributed as much to Steve's development as the exercises themselves. Another aspect of Steve's story that people found hard to believe was his success at the box office. When Hercules first released in Italy, the film made so much money that producers immediately greenlit a sequel. But American distributors were skeptical. They didn't believe Americans would pay to see a bodybuilder play a mythological hero in a low-budget foreign film. Joseph E. Levine, an independent distributor, saw the film and had a different vision. He bought the American distribution rights for a bargain price, then launched the most aggressive marketing campaign ever seen for a foreign film in America. He plastered Steve's image on billboards, magazines, television commercials. The tagline, "The mightiest man who ever lived," appeared everywhere. Critics predicted the film would bomb. They said American audiences were too sophisticated for such simple adventure stories. They were spectacularly wrong. Hercules, played in theaters for months, became one of the highest-grossing films of 1959 and turned Steve Reeves into a household name in America. More importantly, it proved that action heroes didn't need to be average-looking everymen. Audiences actually wanted to see heroes who looked heroic, who had the physical presence to match their legendary deeds. The films Steve made after Hercules varied in quality, some better than others, but they all had one thing in common. Steve's presence elevated them. Even in the cheesiest, lowest-budget productions, when Steve appeared on screen, you couldn't look away. There was something magnetic about him, something that transcended acting ability or production values. He had that indefinable quality that separates movie stars from actors, pure screen presence. Directors learned quickly that the best way to shoot Steve was simply to point the camera at him and let him be himself. Over-direction, complicated staging, excessive dialogue, all of it diminished his impact. But put him in a simple tunic, give him a sword or a club, put him in a physical situation that showcased his strength and athleticism, and magic happened. One director famously said, "Directing Steve Reeves is like directing a force of nature." You don't tell a thunderstorm how to look impressive. You just capture it. As Steve aged and his film career ended, he could have faded into obscurity like many retired actors. Instead, he became more influential. He granted interviews to bodybuilding magazines, sharing his training wisdom with new generations. He appeared at fitness expos and bodybuilding competitions as a special guest, always receiving standing ovations from audiences. But perhaps most importantly, he lived as an example of what natural bodybuilding could achieve long-term. Even in his 60s, Steve maintained a physique that would put most men half his age to shame. He was still training 3 days a week, still following his simple dietary principles, still promoting the idea that bodybuilding should be about health and longevity, not just temporary gains achieved through pharmaceutical shortcuts. When journalists asked him about his legacy, Steve always gave humble responses. "I just showed people what's possible if you train smart, eat right, and stay consistent. I'm nothing special. Anyone can do what I did if they're willing to put in the work." But Steve was special, and everyone who knew him recognized it. Not just because of his physique or his film career, but because of who he was as a person. Stories about Steve's character, his integrity, his generosity are as legendary as the stories about his physical abilities. When fans approached him in public, he never brushed them off, never acted annoyed at being recognized. He'd stop, shake hands, sign autographs, pose for pictures, have genuine conversations. When young bodybuilders wrote him letters asking for advice, he actually wrote back with detailed responses, spending hours crafting thoughtful replies to people he'd never met. When charities asked him to donate time or money, he consistently said yes, using his fame to help causes he believed in. There's a beautiful story about Steve visiting a children's hospital while filming in Italy. He wasn't there for publicity or a photo op. He just heard about sick kids who were fans of his Hercules movies and wanted to visit them. He spent an entire afternoon going room to room, talking to children, making them laugh, flexing his muscles for them, giving them hope that they could be strong like Hercules. The hospital staff said several children's health improved dramatically after his visit, the psychological boost giving them renewed energy to fight their illnesses. That's the kind of impact Steve had, not just as a bodybuilder or actor, but as a human being who genuinely cared about making people's lives better. There's also a profound story about Steve's relationship with fitness and aging. As he got older and the chronic shoulder pain from his chariot accident worsened, doctors told him he needed surgery. Multiple specialists examined him and said the shoulder joint had deteriorated to the point where surgical intervention was necessary if he wanted to avoid increasing disability. Steve went through exploratory surgery to assess the damage, and what doctors found shocked them. The shoulder was far worse than anyone imagined: torn tendons, damaged cartilage, bone grinding against bone. They told Steve that extensive reconstructive surgery would be required, followed by months of painful rehabilitation, with no guarantee he'd ever regain full function. The surgery would be risky, expensive, and debilitating. Steve's response was characteristically stoic. "I've had a good run. My body has given me everything I could have asked for. I'm not going to put myself through all that." He declined the extensive surgery, chose to manage the pain conservatively, and adjusted his lifestyle accordingly. This decision, made purely on his own terms, showed Steve's philosophy about life: quality over quantity, dignity over desperation, acceptance of natural limitations rather than fighting reality at all costs. The last years of Steve's life were spent quietly on his ranch, surrounded by horses, living the peaceful existence he'd dreamed of as a young man. He rarely gave interviews, rarely made public appearances, choosing instead to focus on his private life with his wife Isla. But even in these quiet years, Steve's influence continued growing. The rise of the internet in the 1990s introduced his story to new generations who had never seen his films in theaters. Young bodybuilders discovered photos of his physique and couldn't believe what they were seeing. Internet forums filled with debates about whether his proportions were achievable naturally, whether his strength feats were real or exaggerated, whether the golden age of bodybuilding that he represented was truly superior to the mass monster era that followed. Steve rarely engaged with these online discussions, but when he did, his messages were always consistent. Train naturally, train intelligently. Remember that bodybuilding is about building your body, not destroying it. On May 1st, 2000, at the age of 74, Steve Reeves died of complications from lymphoma. The bodybuilding world mourned. Tributes poured in from around the globe, from champions he'd inspired, from fans whose lives he'd touched, from colleagues who'd worked with him decades earlier. Arnold Schwarzenegger released a statement calling Steve the greatest bodybuilder who ever lived, and crediting him with creating the blueprint that all of us followed. Lou Ferrigno said, "Without Steve Reeves, I would never have become the Incredible Hulk." Sylvester Stallone wrote, "Steve showed us that heroes could look like heroes, that strength and beauty weren't separate things but complementary." But perhaps the most moving tributes came from regular people. The guy who started lifting weights because he saw Hercules as a kid, the woman who gained confidence through fitness after reading Steve's book, the older gentleman who maintained his health into his 80s following Steve's training principles. These stories, thousands upon thousands of them, revealed the true measure of Steve Reeves' impact. Not the titles he won or the money he made, but the lives he changed by proving what natural human potential could achieve. Since his death, Steve's reputation has only grown. As the fitness industry becomes increasingly saturated with supplements, performance-enhancing drugs, and unrealistic body standards promoted through social media deception, more people are looking back at Steve Reeves as the antidote. Proof that extraordinary physiques are possible without pharmaceutical assistance, that aesthetics matter more than mere size, that sustainability and health should be the foundation of any fitness journey. Modern natural bodybuilding federations hold up Steve as their ideal. Classic physique divisions in professional bodybuilding were created specifically to reward the kind of proportions Steve exemplified. Fitness historians study his training methods and dietary approach, often discovering that his simple methods were actually incredibly sophisticated, just expressed without modern jargon and complications. What nobody believed about Steve Reeves until they saw the evidence was that one person could embody so many seemingly contradictory qualities. Massive but proportional, strong but aesthetic, famous but humble, successful but generous, disciplined but balanced. In an age of specialization, where athletes focus on one quality to the exclusion of all others, Steve represented something holistic, something complete. He wasn't just building a physique, he was building a life. The ranch, the horses, the philanthropy, the advocacy for natural training, the happy marriage, the peaceful retirement. These weren't separate from his bodybuilding career. They were extensions of the same philosophy that guided his training: balance, sustainability, natural development, living in harmony with your body's capabilities rather than fighting against them. The stories about Steve Reeves that seemed too good to be true, the incredible physique built naturally, the strength feats that defied belief, the Hollywood success that appeared impossible, the integrity that never wavered, the influence that continues growing decades after his death. All of them turned out to be absolutely, verifiably true. Every photograph confirms the aesthetic perfection. Every film shows the genuine strength and presence. Every interview reveals the humble, thoughtful character. Every testimonial from people who knew him validates the generosity and kindness. Steve Reeves wasn't a myth or a legend or an exaggerated tale. He was real, he was natural, and he was everything that bodybuilding could be at its best. A pursuit of physical excellence that enhances life rather than consuming it, that builds health rather than destroying it, that creates beauty rather than distorting it. And that's the ultimate story that nobody believed until they saw it for themselves. That you don't need drugs to build an incredible physique. You don't need to train 6 days a week until you destroy yourself. You don't need to obsess over every gram of protein and every macro ratio. You don't need to sacrifice your health and happiness on the altar of temporary physical gains. You just need what Steve had: dedication, intelligence, consistency, patience, and a vision of what you want to become. Steve Reeves proved it was possible 70 years ago. The evidence has been staring us in the face ever since. The only question is, will we finally believe it and follow his example, or will we continue chasing shortcuts that lead nowhere? Steve knew the answer. His life was the answer. And that answer is still available to anyone willing to listen, to learn, and to put in the work the natural way, the right way, the Steve Reeves way.